Yeah, Merry Christmas! Glad you come. Glad you. How about some of that good spaghetti? We got everything.
God. Oh, God. Dear Father in heaven, I'm not a praying man, but if you're up there and you can hear me, show me the way. I'm at the end of my rope. Show me the way, oh God.
Are you all right, George? Want somebody to take you home, huh?
This is considered one of the most desperate prayers in the history of cinema, and it's almost ironic that it comes from a movie entitled It's a Wonderful Life. Many of you have seen it, probably, I dare say most of you have seen it, made in 1948 about a man named George Bailey who has a tragic financial disaster, a mistake that he had made, and he had finally come to the end of his rope. I imagine most people in here have been at the end of their rope. You know, we live in a culture that has very little tolerance for desperation. As a matter of fact, we live in a made-up world, a culture that is a social media culture where you create your own world and you create your own life and this image of who you want to be. And facing truth, especially hard truth, is something that we don't like to do. I found a great illustration about the lengths we'll go to avoid facing the hard truth. It comes from a television show called Shark Tank. I don't know if you've ever seen Shark Tank. It's on ABC, and it's where inventors will come to these investors and ask for an investment in their invention. And this invention is incredibly unique, and I don't want to spoil it for you, so I'll just show you the clip.
The Skinny Mirror design offers a subtle, believable slimming reflection designed to help you feel good about your body. This is the first model. This retails for $165. I've seen the potential. Have you taken a look at yourself in the mirror?
Look, you know, I deal in reality.
Afraid.
I will not be part of this sham, because that's what it is.
Okay, that's fine.
And look, you can smile all you want, but the truth is you're lying to people. I'm out, but I also forbid any other shark in investing in this.
Now, the interesting part of this is he forbids everybody else to invest in this skinny mirror, is that this skinny mirror is intended to make you look 10 pounds lighter than you actually are. So when you try on clothes, you look thinner than you really are. And when I saw this, I started thinking, well, there's other things that really should go along with the skinny mirror. How about skinny scales, right? I mean, you have these scales, you see the skinny mirror, so you set your skinny scales, and they will weigh you 10 pounds lighter than you really are. But you know, that's not really enough either. How about skinny glasses? You know, because our spouses will always tell us the truth. So we put glasses on other people so that they will see us as being 10 pounds lighter than we really are. And for all of us who've battled their weight most of their adult life, you realize that, man, there's a lot of comfort maybe here. It's interesting, the market that she actually found for this mirror. She did find a market for the mirror. It wasn't in individual sales to homes. It was for retail establishments to put in their dressing rooms. But if you go into a retail establishment, look in the bottom right-hand corner of the mirror, and if it is a skinny mirror, it has to tell you. So if you're in there and you're looking really good and you don't want to know the truth, don't look down, whatever you do. We'll do anything to run from the truth, but there comes a time when the truth always catches up with us. And sometimes it catches up with us in ways that are really, really tough and really, really hard. And it's just what we need, because often what we need more than anything else in our life are these hard moments of truth. Moments of desperation force us into these truths. You see, it's in these desperate moments that we find out that God's power exposes our weaknesses. It's in these desperate moments that we learn that God's victory comes at the cost of our vulnerability. It's in these desperate moments that we find out that God's deliverance comes out of our desperation. And if that's you and you've been there, I've got really good news for you. And if you're in that time of desperation about anything, family or spouses or whatever, you need to know that if you search through Scripture, you'll find this to always be true. That God is and always has been drawn to desperation. God is and always has been drawn to desperate people in desperate moments and desperate times in their life. And many of you have been in those times. You've been on your knees and you've been in that moment of desperation. And I know there are people in this room that could honestly testify that in that moment of desperation, they saw God in a way that they had never seen him before. They'd experienced God in a way that they had never experienced him before. And today's lesson is about one of those moments. It's about a woman who cries out to God in her moment of desperation. We read about this woman in the book of 1 Samuel. It's the story of Samuel's mother. Her name is Hannah. And you know, mothers have this way of understanding desperation, maybe more so than dads. You know, mothers have this way of tuning in to these feelings of uncertainty. Am I doing this right? And am I a good enough mother for this child? And mothers have a way of tuning in to this feeling of inadequacy. Am I enough to do the job that's been set before me? Am I going to be able, am I the kind of person that can really raise a child to honor God? Mothers have a way of knowing and being pushed to their physical, their emotional, their mental limits. Sometimes they feel really alone, and sometimes all they want is to be alone. I can remember coming home one day from work when our children were small, and Melissa was so excited because she had finally got to go to the bathroom by herself. Some of you understand that feeling. And the worst part is when our children get older, and we spend all this time feeling inadequate and not sure that we're doing the right thing. And we try to teach them the best we can, and then we launch them on the world. And at that point, they get to make their own decisions. And our desperation changes to a different kind of desperation. And we start crying out to a God who is a God that is completely, utterly sold out to free will. That as much as we want God to miraculously change what's going on in the lives of our children sometimes where they may be hurting themselves or they're doing things that we wish they wouldn't do, the reality is that God will allow that to happen, and we still have to trust him, even in our moments of desperation. We meet this Hannah, this woman, in the book of 1 Samuel. We know that she's a wife. Her husband's name is Elkanah. But there's more to her story than that. As we pick up in verse 2, it says he had two wives, Elkanah. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. You see, the source of Hannah's desperation was infertility. Infertility is something that there may be women in this room that you understand, and you understand the desperation that Hannah felt. 1 in 6 women in America will battle infertility. And as you reach the age of 35, over 35, it's 1 in 4. And the people who have dealt with infertility, surveys will tell you that they will say that dealing with infertility and the desperation and the pain that goes along with that is worse than the pain of a death of a loved one. It's worse than the pain that happens through divorce. You know, for those of us who were married to fertile people, we can't even comprehend what this is like. But for Hannah, not only was it this feeling of infertility, it had a lot to do with who she was in her culture. You see, Hannah's infertility takes on a more huge context because in this culture, your ranking in society as a woman had to do with whether or not you could bear children. Your ranking in your family, the way your family viewed you in this society had to do with whether or not you could have children. And if you couldn't have children, you were considered cursed by God. If you couldn't have children, your family wondered about you, about what have you done to make God not honor you in this way. And Hannah was going through all this. It's kind of interesting that that was the culture of the day, because as you look through Scripture, you'll find stories of many women who dealt with infertility. You hear the story of Sarah and Abraham, the story of Rebekah and Isaac, the story of Rachel and Jacob. You hear these stories. You hear the story of Elizabeth, who was the mother of John the Baptist, and all these women dealt with this problem, and they all have two things in common. They were all righteous, yet they were all desperate. And Hannah understood this desperation. And in moments like this, it's much easier to push God away than it is to draw near to, and much less to worship him and honor him. Yet that's what we find Hannah doing. As we pick up in verse 3, and then we'll look at verse 6 and 7, it says, "Now this man, who is Elkanah, her husband, would go up from his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh." And as verse 6 picks up, her rival, see, this was more than a sister wife. This was a rival. Her rival, however, would provoke her bitterly and irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. It happened year after year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she would provoke her, so she wept and she would not eat. Every year, Hannah went with her husband with empty arms. After a year of prayer and a year of nothing, after begging God for a child and wanting a child desperately, year after year, she came up empty. Imagine the humiliation she felt, as Peninnah rubbed her nose in what she felt like was her failure. That Peninnah would not let her forget her heartache, and that this desperation that she was feeling in the deepest part of her being was being recalled to her time after time after time. You see, desperation doesn't happen immediately. Desperation brews. It stews. Because you see, pain plus time equals desperation. It's one thing to feel pain, because everyone will encounter pain. But you have pain over time, you reach desperation, because in the world we live in, God has given us an ordered world. And pain is supposed to hurt, but is also supposed to heal. That if you give pain enough time, it goes away. But in her case, she had this pain and it felt like it was never going to go away. And every year after year, day after day, hour after hour, with this woman Peninnah and her children, she was constantly reminded. And she had gotten to the point where she felt desperate. And as a side note, her husband wasn't a whole lot of help with it. In verse 8, it says, "Then Elkanah, her husband, came to her, and Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" I've preached this lesson before. I've preached this text before. And every time I've preached this text, I've tried to find Elkanah's words and look deeply into them and find the encouragement that God wants to give to Hannah, that he's supposed to be making her feel better. And then finally I woke up one day and said, no, this is one of those moments where we're supposed to look at Elkanah and say, come on, man. I mean, he makes a couple of real rookie mistakes here that we all make. The first thing he does is he wonders why she feels the way she feels, basically saying, don't feel that way. But when you're in a moment of desperation, you feel how you feel, and your feelings are real because they're yours. And then the next thing he does is he assumes that he can be the answer to her problem, that he himself is enough to answer what's hurting her the most, and somehow he can fix things. Am I not better than 10 sons? Oh, that's a rookie mistake. Now, if I stop this lesson here and we all go home, there are some of you that are going to empathize with Hannah. You've been in that time, in that moment, the situation or even a whole season of desperation. And there's some of you that may sympathize with Hannah. You haven't reached that point yet with family or friends or spouses or jobs or careers or finances or whatever it is that causes desperation for you. And you're going to sympathize with Hannah. And I guess that's good. But the beauty of this story is that there's more to it than that. There's more to it than calling attention to her desperation. The beauty of this story is the power that comes from how she deals with this desperation. In 1 Samuel chapter 9, the first part of 9, and then into verse 10, said Hannah rose. And if it says arose in your text, you might want to highlight it, underline it, or whatever. Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. And she, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. Now, when it says here that Hannah rose, it's not talking about posture. It's not saying that Hannah decided one day that she was tired of being on her knees. They were a little bit sore, so she stood up. When Scripture here says that Hannah rose, it's saying that she made a bold and courageous change in her direction. What had been working before was no longer working, and she had to do something differently. And she decided that when all else had failed, and when she could not ignore the condition that she was in, and that she was wallowing in this condition, that something else had to happen. And I tell you what, year after year, for many of us, we can feel the same way. Year after year, some of us have dealt with desperation. And whatever you're dealing with in your desperation, we need to understand that, you know what? We have a God that understands. You know, a lot of people feel like God is like some dads in this world that when they have that feeling of desperation, when you make that bold choice, that bold change, and you finally decide you're going to turn to Him, that He's going to say, oh, well now, after you've totally ruined everything, you're going to come to me. We say that's not who God is. When we decide we want to make a bold change in our life and we turn to Him, He's a good Father. He'll take what He can get. He'll forget your past, and He'll point you to a future. And when she makes this change, after years and years, she decided here to rise and to courageously change direction. And then the change in direction is amazing because it says that she prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. What she did was she changed direction and then she poured herself out, every part of herself, before God. All her pain, all the tragedy in her life, all the feelings of anger toward God, all the feelings of confusion about God, all the things that were in her life. We don't know what she said to the fullest, but we do have a small snippet. But the reality is what she had done is the change in direction here is I'm going to let God know I'm hurt and that I'm broken. And I need to tell you this about pain. And this is real. Pain's not good, and pain is not bad. Pain is just inevitable. All of us are going to deal with pain. But I also want you to know this about God and pain. God is not afraid of our pain. And not only that, God is not shocked when we reveal and cry out our pain to Him. So what she did was she changed direction and she poured herself out before God. And then here's the prayer, verse 11. She made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head. She was going to give him into the priesthood, and since he wasn't a Levite, he would become a priesthood in the Nazarite group. What she's doing here is something kind of unusual. It's not a negotiation. A lot of people look at this and think, okay, this is one of those negotiations. God, if you'll just do this, I'll do this. God's a giver, but God is not a negotiator. And the reason God's not a negotiator is because we don't have anything he needs. I mean, think about it. This is the all-knowing ruler of time, space, and dimension. What do we have that he needs? Because if you want to negotiate, it's this for that, tit for tat. This is not negotiation. What she does here is better than negotiation. This is submission. This is sold out submission. She goes to God. She says this, what I've been doing up to this point is not working. And the reason it's not working is because I want this kid for me. I want this kid to shut up Penina. I want this kid to show Elkanah that yes, I too can have a child. I want this kid because I want to be loved. I want this child for me. And then her direction changes. She pours herself out to God and she says, you know what? I want this God for you. I want this child for you. I want this baby to give to you. I want to honor you this way. And in this prayer, she tells us two things about desperation and desperate prayer. And the first one is that desperation should cause us to look to God. That when we're in that darkest moment, that darkest piece of despair, we should be looking to God, although many people don't. But the biggie is this, that desperation should cause us to ask God to look at us. You see, she's telling God, look down on my situation. The reality of who I am, warts and all, look on my pain. And sometimes that's really hard to do. I just want you to know that God is powerful and he's loving and he's willing to look on our desperation. And I don't know what you may be desperate about. It might be your marriage, it might be your kids, it might be your career, it might be finance, it could be a lot of things. But I do know this. Wherever you are, he sees you. In your darkest wilderness, he sees you. In your greatest moments of abject loneliness, he's there. In the darkest desperation in your heart, he's with you. Because we have a God who looks on our pain. Here's the best part of the story. We talked about Hannah. We talked about what she does with her pain. And now we need to know what it does to her and in her. In verse 18, we read the rest of the story. It says, she said, let your maidservant find favor in your sight. And so the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Now remember, up to this point, she has prayed, poured herself out before God. She's talked to the priest, and now she's about to walk away. But when she goes there, she is bitter and angry and hurt and desperate, and now her face is taking on a brand new countenance. And when you read 1 Samuel chapter 1, there's a couple things you're going to notice, or I hope you do, and that is, at this point, God has promised her absolutely nothing. At this point, nothing in her life had changed. And so you have to ask the obvious question, right? Why was she happy? Why did she change? I mean, God didn't change. Nothing in her life had changed, but she changed. Why was she happy? And that's because hope is a powerful, powerful thing. It's the expectation that God will roll up his sleeves and wade into our situation of desperation. And that he cares and will act. And he'll help. You know, the greatest blessing of desperate faith is found in the freedom of relinquishing control. She had finally gotten to the moment where this was no longer about her. It was about what God's will was in her life. She didn't know if she would ever have a child. She didn't know if her situation would ever change. But she was certain God knew about it. And she was certain that her heart had changed. And there's a great deal of freedom in admitting that we're not in control and believing that God is. Verse 19 says, Then they arose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord and returned again to their house in Ramah. And Elkanah had relations with Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. I love this verse. God didn't just see her. He didn't just hear her. He didn't just notice her. In her darkest moment of despair, he remembered her. He acted. Well, if you know the rest of the story, you know that she did indeed have a son. She named him Samuel. And Samuel means heard by God. Every time, until she gave her son over to be in the priesthood, every time that she looked at him and said, Samuel, wash your hands before dinner. Samuel, it's time to come in. It's dark. Samuel, it's time to go to bed. Samuel, I love you. Every time she mentioned his name, she thought about that day and those steps and that prayer and how God saw, how God heard, and how God remembers. It's my prayer that in your greatest moments of desperation, you'll always know if you'll rise and pour yourself out to him, he will see, he will hear, and God will remember you.